They called me a system error. The only thing I'd ever done was build the damn system $40 million worth of code they thought I'd leave behind when they erased my name from the company roster. I didn't fight back. I didn't argue. I simply erased myself from everything, left them with a perfectly legal, perfectly empty shell of what used to be their crown jewel. They wanted me gone. Fine, but they never specified I couldn't take my work with me. My name is Morgan Elwood, and at 1:43 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, my phone lit up with a call that would end 6 years of my life and begin something far more satisfying. I was propped up in bed, still fighting the lingering effects of COVID complications that had knocked me flat for 3 weeks. My lungs felt like they were filled with wet cement, and the simple act of reaching for my phone left me breathless. The caller ID showed Randall Tate, our new CEO, the man who'd swept in 8 months ago with his Stanford MBA and his promises to revolutionize our trajectory. Morgan, his voice was crisp, awake, like he'd been waiting for the perfect moment to make this call. I'll keep this brief. Your position has been eliminated, effective immediately. Your access has been revoked. HR will send severance details in the morning. I waited for more, an explanation, a thank you for building the infrastructure that had carried this company from a 10-person startup to a tech darling worth hundreds of millions. Instead, I got silence. That's it. My voice came out steadier than I felt. That's it. We're moving in a new direction. Your approach doesn't align with our vision going forward. My approach. The approach that had written every critical line of our supply chain management system. The approach that had pulled all-nighters debugging code while Randall was still pushing papers at McKinsey. I see. I shifted in bed, ignoring the sharp pain in my chest not from the illness, but from the casual cruelty of it all. And the system, the codebase. The team will handle it. We've brought in some real talent from Google and Amazon, people who understand scale. Real talent, as if I hadn't scaled our system from handling 50 transactions a day to 50,000. As if I hadn't architected the entire framework that these real talent developers would now inherit. Randall, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. You do realize I built that system from scratch, that there are components. We're aware of your contributions. He cut me off. Everything's been documented. We're good. Documented? I almost laughed. They thought documentation could replace 6 years of intimate knowledge, of understanding every quirk and feature I'd lovingly crafted into that code. One question, I said, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Why now? Why at 1:43 in the morning while I'm on medical leave? The board made the decision this afternoon. I thought it best to inform you immediately rather than wait. His tone suggested he thought he was doing me a favor. Look, Morgan, sometimes things just don't work out. You're talented, but you're not a team player. You resist change. You question too much. In the end, you were... He paused, and I could practically hear him choosing his words. A hiring mistake we needed to correct. A mistake. 6 years of my life, thousands of hours of code, the very foundation of their $40 million valuation, reduced to a mistake. I understand, I said, and I did. I understood perfectly. Thank you for the clarity. Good. HR will... I hung up. There was nothing left to say. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, my laptop casting a pale glow across the room. My fingers found the keyboard by muscle memory, and I logged into my personal server, the one where I'd always kept backups, just in case. Old habit from my freelance days. They'd revoked my access to the company systems, but they'd forgotten something crucial. The development server I'd set up in the early days, running on an AWS instance under my personal account, paid for with my credit card when the company was too cash-strapped to afford proper infrastructure. I'd been meaning to transfer it over, but somehow it had never made it onto anyone's priority list. I smiled for the first time since picking up the phone. They thought they were erasing me, but they'd forgotten that you can't erase the architect from the architecture, not when she built it with her own hands, her own logic, her own careful fail-safes. My fingers flew across the keyboard, not to destroy that would be petty, illegal, beneath me, but to understand exactly what was mine and what was theirs, to map out every function, every module, every carefully crafted piece of code that bore my signature. They called me a mistake. They were about to learn that the only mistake here was thinking they could delete me from my own creation. The irony wasn't lost on me as I scrolled through old commits at 3 in the morning. My breath still ragged from the COVID that had given them the perfect opportunity to cut me loose. 6 years ago, I'd walked into Thalarian Systems when it was nothing more than a rented office space in Palo Alto and a CEO with a vision. David Holbrook, the original CEO, had found me through a Stack Overflow post where I'd solved a complex supply chain optimization problem that had stumped senior developers. "I need someone who thinks like that," he'd said over coffee, his eyes bright with the fervor of a true believer. Someone who sees the elegant solution, not just the obvious one. I'd been employee number 12, the first actual engineer hired specifically to build what would become our core product, while others focused on the flashy front end or the sales deck. I dove deep into the architecture. Every night, I'd go home with problems swirling in my head. How do we track inventory across multiple warehouses in real time? How do we predict supply chain disruptions before they happen? How do we make it all work seamlessly? The first version was ugly but functional. I'd written it in Python, staying up for 72 hours straight during our first client demo. When it worked, when the CEO of a major retail chain watched his entire supply chain light up on our dashboard like a Christmas tree, David had actually cried. "You did it, Morgan," he'd said, gripping my shoulders. "You fucking did it." Over the next 3 years, I rebuilt that system twice, moved it to Go for better performance, implemented machine learning algorithms for demand forecasting, created a modular architecture that could scale to handle Fortune 500 companies. Every line of code had my fingerprints on it, my logic embedded in its DNA. When we landed Series B funding, things started to change. The board wanted experienced leadership. David fought them at first, but after the Series C round last year, $40 million, that valued us at nearly $500 million, he was overruled. Enter Randall Tate, the golden boy with his perfect resume and his talk of synergies and pivot potential. I watched Randall operate during his first month. The way he glad-handed investors and charmed board members. He spoke about our technology like he understood it, throwing around terms like distributed systems and microservices architecture without grasping what they meant in our context. In meetings, he'd nod along as I explained technical challenges, then summarize my points back to the room as if they were his ideas. The new hires started arriving 2 months later. Industry veterans, Randall called them. People with Google and Amazon on their resumes who looked at our codebase like archaeologists examining primitive tools. They wanted to rebuild everything, to stamp their own signatures on my work. "This is technical debt," one of them had said during a code review, pointing at a module I'd spent weeks perfecting. "We should refactor this entire section." "That's not technical debt," I'd explained patiently. "It's designed that way to handle edge cases specific to our client workflows. If you refactor it, you'll break compatibility with—" "Morgan," Randall had interrupted, that condescending smile playing at his lips. "Let's not be precious about legacy code. We need to think bigger." Legacy code. My code. The code that was currently handling millions in transactions every day without a hiccup. The isolation began subtly. First, I was left off a meeting invite, then another. Soon, I was finding out about major architectural decisions through commit messages on GitHub. When I raised concerns, I was told I was being resistant to change and territorial. "You need to learn to let go," Randall had said during my last performance review. "This isn't a solo project anymore. It's a team effort." But it had never been a solo project. I'd always been part of a team. I'd mentored junior developers, collaborated with product managers, stayed late to help ops troubleshoot issues. The difference was that I understood the system's heartbeat, its rhythm. I knew which warnings could be ignored and which indicated imminent disaster. I knew why certain seemingly inefficient patterns existed, because I'd tried the efficient ones and watched them fail under real-world conditions. They didn't want that knowledge. They wanted a clean slate, a system they could claim as their own, and I was the inconvenient reminder that it had existed before them, that it had been built by someone they now considered a hiring mistake. As I documented each module I'd created, each algorithm I'd designed, each clever solution I'd implemented, I realized something: they hadn't just stolen my code. They'd stolen my credibility, my contribution, my very existence in the company's history, in their new narrative. The system had always existed, waiting for real talent to come and improve it. But code doesn't lie, and buried deep in the repository, in the commit history they'd never bothered to read, was the truth. Every line, every function, every breakthrough timestamped and attributed. They could erase me from the org chart. They could revoke my access and pretend I was a mistake. But they couldn't erase the fact that without me, their $40 million system was just an empty promise waiting to be exposed. The beauty of being paranoid is that sometimes you're right. 3 years ago, when David was still CEO and we were scaling rapidly, I'd insisted on building what I called the Internal Logic Verification Layer, ILVL for short. It was my baby, a self-monitoring system that would ensure data integrity across all modules, catch cascading failures before they happened, and maintain system coherence even under extreme load. "Seems like overkill," David had said when I presented the concept. "We're doing fine without it." "We're doing fine now," I'd countered. "But what happens when we're processing not thousands but millions of transactions? What happens when one small error compounds across distributed systems?" He'd approved it. Eventually, more importantly, he'd signed the addendum to my employment contract that specified the ILVL as my personal intellectual property, licensed to Thalarian Systems for use but remaining under my copyright. It was a standard arrangement for specialized components. David believed in letting engineers maintain ownership of their innovations. It incentivized excellence. That signature, gathering digital dust in my personal files, was about to become very relevant. Over the following weeks, as I recovered from COVID and processed my unceremonious dismissal, I studied the system logs from my personal server. The new team was busy. I'd give them that. Commits flooded in as they refactored, reorganized, and optimized my code. They were preparing for something big. The frequency of updates and the nature of the changes pointed to a major deployment. Then I found it, buried in a carelessly public Slack archive that someone had failed to properly secure. They were planning to sell access to our core system to Klaus Industries, a German conglomerate looking to modernize their supply chain. $40 million for a 5-year exclusive license to the technology I'd built. My technology, with my ILVL at its heart. I pulled up the employment contract, the addendum David had signed, the copyright registrations I'd filed for the ILVL components. Everything was in order. Thalarian had the right to use my code, but they didn't own it outright, and they certainly didn't have the right to sublicense it without my permission. The revenge plan formed not from anger but from a cold, clear understanding of the situation. They wanted to erase me. Fine. I'd erase myself completely, including every trace of my copyrighted code from their system. But I wouldn't be reckless. I wouldn't be the disgruntled ex-employee who sabotaged systems out of spite. Everything would be legal, documented, and absolutely devastating. First, I backed up everything, not just my code, but the entire development history, every version, every commit, every comment and discussion. My external drives hummed as terabytes of data transferred, creating an irrefutable record of who built what and when. Next, I began identifying every component that contained my ILVL code. It was everywhere I'd designed it that way, like a nervous system running through a body. The ILVL touched every major function. The inventory tracking system used it to maintain consistency across warehouses. The prediction algorithms relied on it for data verification. The reporting module, the crown jewel that produced those beautiful real-time dashboards, was essentially a pretty face on top of ILVL's data processing. They'd tried to understand it. I could see from their commits. Comments like, "to do, figure out what this does," and deprecated, "but everything breaks if we remove it," littered the codebase. They'd given up trying to refactor it, choosing instead to work around it like water flowing around a stone. I started extracting my code methodically. Not deleting that would be destruction of company property. Instead, I was exercising my right as the copyright holder to revoke the license for my proprietary components. Each extraction was documented, notarized digitally, and backed up in triplicate. The beautiful irony was that the system would still run without the ILVL. It would compile, deploy, and even process transactions, but without the verification layer, without the careful checks and balances I'd built in, it would be like a house without a foundation, stable in appearance, but ready to collapse at the first strong wind. As I worked through the night, I thought about sending a warning, a final email to Randall explaining what would happen if they proceeded without my code. But then I remembered his voice on that 1:43 a.m.'s call. A hiring mistake we needed to correct. No, let them discover their mistake on their own. I opened my email client and began drafting messages to my lawyer. Subject line: unauthorized use of copyrighted code, Thalarian Systems. Attached were the contracts, the copyright registrations, and most damning, the evidence of their plan to sell my code to Klaus Industries. By 5 a.m., everything was in motion. The extraction scripts were ready, waiting for my command. The legal documents were prepared. All that remained was to wait for them to take the next step. They thought they were building on solid ground. They had no idea that I'd already pulled the foundation out from under them. They just hadn't felt the tremors yet. My phone buzzed with a text from a former colleague. "Heard about what happened. That's fucked up. You okay?" I smiled, typing back, "Never better. Sometimes being erased is exactly what you need to disappear." They wanted me gone. They were about to get their wish. But they'd learned too late that when you erase the architect, you better make sure you don't need the architecture. The systematic erasure of my existence at Thalarian began 2 weeks after my termination call. Sarah Martinez, a junior developer I'd mentored, reached out through LinkedIn with a message that made my blood run cold. "They're making us rewrite all the documentation. Randall says we need to remove any single-person dependencies from our technical specs. Your name is being deleted from everything." Single-person dependencies. That's what 6 years of innovation had become. But they'd made a crucial error. In their haste to rewrite history, they'd forgotten that I still had access to the shared Google Drive through my personal account and oversight from the early days when we'd used personal emails before transitioning to corporate ones. I could watch in real time as they sanitized documents, replacing "created by Morgan Elwood" with "developed by Thalarian engineering team." I screenshot everything, every revision, every deletion, every lie. The Friday afternoon meeting where they'd planned the final phase of my erasure was supposed to be secret, but Tom Nakamura, one of the original engineers who'd worked alongside me for years, recorded it on his phone and sent it to me that evening. His message was simple: "You should hear this." Randall's voice filled my apartment. "The Klaus Industries deal closes in 6 weeks. I need all references to individual contributors removed from our IP documentation. We're selling them a Thalarian product, not someone's pet project." "What about the copyright notices in the code?" someone asked. "Morgan's name is all over the ILVL components." "Strip them," Randall replied without hesitation. "Replace with standard company copyright. Legal says it's work for hire anyway." Work for hire, except it wasn't, and I had the signed contracts to prove it. That night, I composed an email. Not to Randall, he'd made his position clear. Instead, I sent it to David Holbrook, the original CEO, copying the 3 board members who'd been there since the beginning. The subject line was simple: regarding Thalarian's use of my copyrighted code. I kept it professional, factual. I attached the original employment addendum clearly stating the ILVL remained my intellectual property. I included screenshots of the recent documentation changes. I mentioned, almost casually, that I'd noticed preparation for a major licensing deal with Klaus Industries that would include my copyrighted components. "I want to ensure all parties are aware of the intellectual property considerations before any agreements are finalized," I wrote. "As the copyright holder of the ILVL components, I have not authorized their sublicensing or commercial distribution beyond Thalarian's internal use." The response came at 11:37 p.m. from David himself. "Morgan, I had no idea. Let me look into this." But Randall was faster. Monday morning, I received a formal cease and desist letter from Thalarian's law firm, claiming all code written during my employment belonged to the company. They demanded I delete any copies of proprietary Thalarian intellectual property in my possession. Perfect. They just created a paper trail acknowledging the code's value while simultaneously trying to steal it. My lawyer, Patricia Wong, laughed when she read their letter. "They're claiming work for hire on code you explicitly retained copyright on with signed documents. This is either gross incompetence or deliberate IP theft." "Both," I said. "They're hoping I'll roll over. That I'll be the good little fired employee who disappears quietly. And will you? I smiled. I'm going to disappear. All right, and I'm taking every line of my code with me. That afternoon, I initiated the extraction. Not dramatically, not all at once. Instead, I filed formal copyright notices with the U.S. Copyright Office for every ILVL component, establishing a clear paper trail of ownership. Then I sent Thalarian's legal team a formal notice of license revocation, effective in 30 days. Per the terms of my employment addendum dated April 5, 2019, I wrote, I am hereby revoking Thalarian Systems' license to use, modify, or distribute the internal logic verification layer and all associated components. You have 30 days to remove all ILVL code from your systems. The panic was immediate. Tom texted me, all hell is breaking loose. Randall's screaming at the engineers to figure out what ILVL actually does. They're just now realizing it's everywhere. I pulled up my personal monitoring dashboard, yes. I'd built myself a backdoor view of system health metrics. Nothing invasive, just basic performance data. The new team was frantically trying to trace every ILVL dependency. Their commit messages grew increasingly desperate. Urgent map ILVL integration points, and critical find ILVL replacement solutions. But here's the thing about building something into the foundation of a system. By the time you realize you need it, it's too late to replace it. Every module they'd built over the past 8 months assumed ILVL would be there, silently verifying data, catching errors, maintaining consistency. Randall tried to call me directly. I let it go to voicemail. Morgan, this is Randall. We need to talk about this licensing issue. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Call me back. A misunderstanding. As if accidentally trying to sell $40 million worth of someone else's code could be a misunderstanding. I didn't call back. Instead, I sent another email, this time copying Klaus Industries' legal team, whom I'd found through LinkedIn. Just a friendly notice that any licensing agreement for Thalarian's supply chain system should carefully review the intellectual property status of all components, particularly the internal logic verification layer. The responses came fast. Klaus Industries wanted clarification. The board wanted answers. David wanted to meet. And Randall wanted me gone. But I already was. He just hadn't realized yet that I'd taken the heart of his $40 million deal with me. The 30-day notice period passed like a slow-motion car crash. I watched from a distance as Thalarian's engineering team worked around the clock, trying to reverse engineer my code before the deadline. Their GitHub activity was frantic branches with names like ILVL Replacement Urgent and Emergency Verification Layer sprouted daily, only to be abandoned when they realized the complexity of what they were trying to replicate. On day 29, I executed the final phase. Using the access they'd forgotten to revoke that old development server still humming along on my personal AWS account, I ran my extraction script. It was surgical, precise. The script identified every function, every method, every line that contained my copyrighted ILVL code and removed it, leaving behind empty function calls and null pointers. I didn't destroy anything. I didn't corrupt their data or plant logic bombs. I simply took what was mine, as was my legal right. The system would still compile, it would still run, but like a car without oil, it would seize up the moment it faced any real pressure. The beauty of my extraction was its completeness. I'd built ILVL to be indispensable, woven into the fabric of the system like steel rebar in concrete. Without it, the concrete might hold its shape for a while, but the first stress test would reveal the missing infrastructure. At 11:59 p.m. on day 30, I sent the final email to Thalarian's legal team. Per my notice dated 30 days ago, all ILVL components have been removed from Thalarian systems. The license revocation is now complete. Any continued use of ILVL code constitutes copyright infringement. Tom called me at 12:15 a.m. Morgan, it's bad, really bad. The system is up, but nothing's working right. Inventory counts are drifting. The prediction algorithms are spitting out garbage. The real-time dashboards are showing data from 3 hours ago. That's not my problem anymore, I said, though I felt a pang for the chaos the engineering team was facing. They weren't the ones who'd decided to erase me. The Klaus Industries demo is tomorrow, Tom continued. Randall's been promising them a flawless showcase of our scalability. The entire deal hinges on it. I knew. I'd seen the emails, the preparations, the promises of a system that could handle Klaus's massive European supply chain, a system built on my code, sold without my permission, demonstrated without my architecture. Tom, I said quietly, you might want to update your resume and tell the others to do the same. The next morning, I didn't need insider information to know what happened. Tech news sites lit up with the story. Thalarian Systems demo disaster puts $40 million deal in jeopardy. The details were sparse but damning. System failures, data inconsistencies, real-time processing that wasn't real-time at all. My phone buzzed with a call from Patricia, my lawyer. Klaus Industries is asking questions about the IP issues you raised. They want to know why core components were removed right before their demo. What did Thalarian say? They're claiming it was a routine refactoring that went wrong, but Klaus isn't buying it. They're demanding full IP disclosure before moving forward. That afternoon, the other shoe dropped. A forensic audit of the codebase revealed the truth they'd tried so hard to hide. The entire system relied on components that Thalarian didn't fully own. The Git history, which they'd forgotten to sanitize, showed years of commits attributed to me, each tagged with copyright notices they'd recently tried to strip. David Holbrook called me personally. Morgan, I'm sorry. I had no idea what Randall was doing. The board is furious. Klaus is threatening to walk away unless we can resolve the IP issues. There's nothing to resolve, I said calmly. I own the ILVL code. I've revoked the license. If you want to use it, you'll need to negotiate a new agreement. With me, not as an employee, but as an independent IP holder. What do you want? I thought about it. What did I want? Money, recognition, my job back. None of those things seemed sufficient anymore. I want the truth, I said finally. I want Thalarian to publicly acknowledge that I created the core architecture. I want my name restored to all documentation, and I want a licensing agreement that reflects the true value of what I built. Randall will never. Then you don't get the code, and without it, your $40 million system is worth exactly what it can do right now, which, from what I'm hearing, isn't much. The silence on the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, David spoke. Let me talk to the board. But Morgan, for what it's worth, you were never a mistake. You were the best hire I ever made. Too little, too late. But at least now they understood the cost of erasing someone from their own creation. The system still ran. Technically, it processed transactions. Technically, but without the invisible foundation I'd built, it was like a house of cards in a windstorm standing only until the first real gust. I ended the call and closed my laptop. Somewhere across the city, Randall was learning that when you call someone a mistake and try to steal their work, you better make sure you can survive without them. The $40 million system they'd tried to sell wasn't theirs to sell, and now everyone knew it. The email that would unravel everything took me 3 days to write. Not because I struggled with the words, but because I wanted to ensure every sentence was precise, every claim supported by evidence, every accusation backed by documentation. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about truth. To Board of Directors, Thalarian Systems, CC David Holbrook, Senior Leadership Team, Legal Department, BCC Patricia Wong, Personal Legal Counsel, subject formal notice of intellectual property violations and fraudulent misrepresentation. The opening was direct. This letter serves as formal notice of multiple intellectual property violations committed by Thalarian Systems under the leadership of CEO Randall Tate, including attempted theft of copyrighted code, fraudulent misrepresentation to potential clients, and deliberate destruction of corporate records. I laid out the timeline with surgical precision. The signed addendum from April 5, 2019, clearly establishing my ownership of the ILVL components, screenshots of the documentation before and after my termination, showing the systematic removal of my name, the Slack messages discussing the Klaus Industries deal, including Randall's explicit instruction to strip Morgan's copyright notices. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. 3 days after my termination, Randall had sent an email to the engineering team that Tom had forwarded to me. In it, Randall wrote, We need to eliminate any legal exposure from former employees. If anyone asks, the ILVL system was developed collectively by the team. Morgan Elwood had minimal involvement in core architecture decisions. Minimal involvement in the system I'd built from scratch. I attached everything: employment contracts, copyright registrations, Git logs showing 10,000 commits over 6 years, architecture documents with my name on every page. Even the original whiteboard photos from 2019, where I'd sketched out the ILVL concept while David watched. Furthermore, I continued, I have evidence that Mr. Tate knowingly misrepresented Thalarian's ownership of this technology to Klaus Industries, potentially exposing both companies to significant legal liability. This constitutes securities fraud if any investors were similarly misled about the company's intellectual property assets. Securities fraud, the nuclear option, but when someone tries to steal $40 million of your work, you don't pull punches. I outlined my demands clearly: immediate public acknowledgement of my role as chief architect of the system, restoration of all documentation to accurately reflect historical contributions, a formal licensing agreement for any commercial use of ILVL components, compensation for the attempted unauthorized sale of my intellectual property, a forensic audit by an independent third party to ensure compliance. Failure to address these violations within 7 business days will result in formal legal action, including but not limited to copyright infringement claims, injunctions against the Klaus Industries deal, and notification to relevant regulatory bodies regarding potential securities fraud. Before sending, I added one final attachment: a technical analysis showing exactly how the system would degrade without ILVL, performance projections, failure scenarios, scalability limits. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't just about legal rights, it was about the technical reality that their $40 million product was built on a foundation they didn't own and couldn't replicate. I hit send at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday. The response was immediate. My phone started buzzing with calls I didn't answer. Randall, David, board members, unknown numbers that were probably lawyers. I let them all go to voicemail while I sipped coffee and watched the sun set over San Francisco. Patricia called at 6 p.m. Their general counsel just contacted me. They want an emergency meeting. Tonight. Tell them I'm unavailable. They have my terms in writing. Morgan, they're panicking. The Klaus deal is supposed to close Monday. If this goes public. When? I corrected. When this goes public, unless they meet my terms. That night, Tom texted me screenshots from the company Slack, chaos, emergency board meetings, the engineering team trying desperately to understand what legal exposure they might have. Someone had leaked that there were IP complications, and speculation was running wild. By Friday morning, the tech press had caught wind. Thalarian Systems faces IP crisis days before major deal, read one headline. Another, founded on stolen code inside Thalarian's intellectual property scandal. I hadn't leaked anything. I didn't need to. When you send a detailed legal notice to a dozen people, word gets out. When those people start panicking and calling emergency meetings, people notice. When a $40 million deal suddenly develops complications, investors ask questions. David called again at 9 a.m. This time, I answered. The board has called an emergency session, he said without preamble. Randall's been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. We need to resolve this. You have my terms. Morgan, please, the company. The company called me a mistake, I interrupted. The company tried to erase me from my own work. The company attempted to sell my code without permission. I don't owe the company anything beyond what I've offered a chance to make this right. What about the people, the engineers who had nothing to do with this, if Thalarian goes under? He was right. The rank-and-file employees weren't responsible for Randall's actions. But that wasn't my problem to solve. Then maybe the board should have thought about that before letting him destroy documentation and attempt to steal intellectual property. I said, My terms are non-negotiable. You have 4 days left. I hung up and turned off my phone. The next move was theirs. But I already knew how this would end. When you build something integral into a system, when you weave your work so deeply into the fabric that it can't be extracted without everything unraveling, you don't need to destroy anything. You just need to take back what's yours and let gravity do the rest. The collapse came faster than even I had anticipated. By Monday morning, Klaus